I didn't actually start with nothing. So this is a bit of a homecoming for me. So I lived in Detroit. I moved to Detroit in 1988, right, Ken? Yeah. Ken, would you stand up for a second? So Prakash Kinjale, otherwise known as Ken, Ken and I started our work at Centel when it was up on Crooks Road. Within days of each other, and I first met Ken when he was rolling in it was in the washroom actually, which sounds peculiar, but that's where it was when he was rolling in his wheelie. That was in 1988, so this is a bit of a homecoming back for me. I live in Chicago right now. And I look back for why that is relevant to the business that I built. But I thought in the 10, 15 minutes that we have right now, I'll tell you the headline of the business, and then maybe try to explore the question of why we succeeded when the other 50 or so companies that began in our space over this period of time, didn't. And I do have the benefit of being the Monday morning quarterback. So we have, and I will try to avoid the revisionist history here. But there are probably some lessons in some of the things we either accidentally or deliberately did. So first, the problem that Fieldglass and its many competitors set out to solve was that large firms who engaged huge amounts of contract labor, meaning in the thousands or tens of thousands, did not have a good way to manage the procurement, the payments, and so on around that particular contract labor. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second and just ask for a little silence at the back on behalf of the upcoming speakers too, because it's a bit distracting. Thank you. So the problem we set out to solve, which is actually very familiar with two companies that are in Detroit, because this was among the oldest users of contingent labor in the country, the auto companies and the suppliers, was that it's what is essentially an HR problem gets recast as a procurement problem, right? The act of bringing in lots of workers that are not on your payroll. So they bypass all the normal HR systems and the scrutinies and so on. And this had become large and unmanaged. And as most of you know, the issue of people who don't work for your company but are somehow performing services for your company has become bigger and bigger. It goes by various names. Some of it is outsourcing. Some of it is the rise of the free agent economy and temporary workers and so on and so forth. The current estimates are that something like 40 or 45% of the workforce may, in some ways, be contingent, but they're not being managed. So back in the year, late 1999, 2000, November 1999 is when I started the company. It was already an industry. And I was having a conversation with someone who was complimenting me on the original idea. It was not an original idea. There were 5 or 6 companies, including a little piece of software that Centel, where we worked, had developed, trying to address this problem. In fact, the first one I could find was a firm called Chimes, developed right out of here in Detroit, that was addressing the problem of the contingent workforce. Yet, of the $750 million or so that I've been able to calculate of venture money that went into this industry, funding approximately 40 to 50 companies, after 15 years, there has been one exit, and that was Fieldglass. One return of capital with total equity value of approximately 1.2 billion. Right? All that money has basically, disappeared into the sector, and one company won. So the question I want to try to explore, again with the benefit of hindsight, is why was it us? Because on the face of it, we were probably the least likely to succeed. I had a services background. I was with Centel IT Services. I was with McKinsey for a few years. Both those, by the way, I considered negatives for an entrepreneur at that stage. So that was one thing against us. The second was we were in Chicago. And they used to joke about the Midwest haircut on valuations, right back then. That's if anybody funded you at all. So that was the second thing. The third was that we had competitors that were backed by really brand name firms. There was Elance. Elance is a different firm now, but back then it was in our space, was backed by Kleiner. And they would, fly around. And Vinod, actually one of, probably a time member at some point, Vinod had a piece in HBR. When I was in business school, I read a piece in HBR. So there were others that were well set up to succeed. So why did we succeed? I want to talk about 4 or 5 things that I believe by either luck or skill went right for us in the building of this business, and there might be some takeaways there. The first, I think, was loosely what I would call the business model. But more generally, those of us who are entrepreneurs, or executives, which is probably everyone in the room, knows that when a new industry starts to develop, things are very fuzzy and you don't know how it's going to play out. And one of the challenges of the entrepreneur is to figure out, what is my entry point and how do I fit into this space? Who is my customer? These are actually not easy questions, because in our space, if you think of large buyers of contingent labor, you have the buyers, and there are many roles amongst the buyers: procurement, HR, finance, IT, and so on. There are suppliers, the staffing firms, the offshore providers, the consulting firms, and then there are the workers. Who do you choose as your customer? Turns out that people made choices in favor of each of these groups. So people chose the workers as a customer, and the job board sector and others developed along that. People chose the suppliers as customers. And there was a whole class of software called professional services automation, PSA. Many of you might know names like Niku and others that developed around that sector. And then some chose the buyer. We were among them. I had a very simple calculation for why I chose the buyer, and because that's who has the money, right? There's that old joke about, if you remember the movie, I think it was Great Train Robbery or something, where Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, was asked by the judge, "Why do you rob banks? Why did you rob banks?" And his response was, "Well, that's where the money is." And so there seems to be a truth about business models in general, that you want to go as far upstream to where the money really originates. And in this case, it was with the buyer. So we got that right. We addressed that problem right. Turns out there were still 20 or 30 companies doing that. I think the second decision an entrepreneur has to make is, how exactly am I going to go to market? Are there partners I can leverage? Who are they? Why do they win? Why would they want me as a partner, and so on? In our case, we decided that the main competitor/partner community was going to be the staffing firm. The people who are in fact providing the contingent labor, into the marketplace. Most of our, or rather half of our competitors, the main ones, actually chose to compete with the staffing firms and provide these on-site services that are, in our industry, they're called MSPs, managed service providers. So think of a large firm like a Ford or GM. They can't really do that much with the technology alone, right? They need somebody to come in and set up an on-site shop, a project office, so to say, and staff it with somebody who pulls the levers and, sets up the administrative console in the application. Think of a bus driver and a bus. Both need each other, otherwise you don't have a bus service, basically. The bus would be an analogy for the technology platform that we built, but you still need a bus driver. Our competitors, many of them, made a decision to be in both businesses, to make the bus and drive the bus. In other words, staff the project office and build the technology. The decision we made is to stay out of the project office business, because it seemed like a manual staffing business, and you'd be in that business, and it just seemed like a different business. And I wanted to stay pure to the software side of it. That's what we did. And I'll fast forward this story here, because it turned out that's the right model. You forego near-term revenue in the service of a business model that will, in the long run, serve you better and will stay more pristine. And I think one of the disciplines about raising outside capital, and for those who are investors, I didn't always think that outside investors added value, but they actually do, and I learned that over time. And the main value my investors added is by really asking difficult questions around questions that I thought were settled issues. And I would bristle in the early days, but I learned that the act of addressing what were not, in fact, settled issues caused us to refine the business model a lot. And we ended up building a model that was a beautiful thing. I think one of the greatest act of creation of an entrepreneur is the work of art that we call a business model. And when you get it right, it hums. And you can step back from it and it's not going to collapse. And we built a model that was close to 100% recurring revenue, where the customers were paying us $3, $4, in some cases $5 million a year for a pure SaaS cloud offering. And it took about a year or more for it to break even, but after that it was a 90% contribution margin. So our business at the end of the day, the overall Fieldglass business, was close to 40% EBITDA, growing top line at 30%. It took 6 to 7 years to get there, 6 to 7 years of losing money to get there, right? So this was not, let me tell you, there were some long board meetings and very painful board meetings because you don't know how it's going to turn out. But I think we got the partnering right, the pricing right, the business model right. And if I had to add a couple of other things that resulted in the final success, one was a very unique Midwestern culture of loyalty, I would say, or a sense of community. The Midwest gets beaten up a lot about not being one of the coasts and flyover country and this and that. So I think, every entrepreneur thinks of the negative. What's the negative space? You're saying that, but what's the thing you're not saying? And the thing that never gets said is that where we win is this idea of community. And so we built a culture of loyalty that when the race is long, it shines. The tortoise wins over the hare if you're going a long distance. And most companies take a very long time to build. The examples we see in the public eye are not common. What is probably more common is this type of experience where you're running this thing for a decade or more. And then the loyalty and the community of the Midwest really kicks in. And I think that was huge. My promise to the group, because I sensed early that might be an advantage, my promise to the group was that I will never cross the finish line by myself. We will cross it together. So our stock and our option distribution went broad and deep. Everyone, including the newest hire or the newest person, was saw some pretty significant upside when we had a big outcome. There's a secret sauce in there, somewhere that probably those of you who run companies in the Midwest can figure out. So, those are my Monday morning quarterback theories on why I think this business succeeded. I appreciate your listening, and it's great to be part of this group. Thank you.